Welcome to the Free Library of Philadelphia. My name is Ian Sheffer, and I'm an infectious diseases fellow at Temple University Hospital, as well as a fellow at Temple's Center for Bioethics, Urban Health, and Policy. I'm also a proud 1995 graduate of U.S. Space Camp. It is my great honor to be able to introduce one of the world's most accomplished astronauts and the first Canadian to walk in space, Colonel Chris Hadfield. In a stellar 35-year career that included flying fighter jets, testing experimental aircraft, 2 missions aboard the Space Shuttle, and 6 months aboard the International Space Station, Colonel Hadfield logged more than 4,000 hours in space. He also served as commander of the International Space Station, which he once had to break into with a Swiss Army knife. While in space, he built a worldwide social media following with his blog, Twitter posts, and countless question and answer sessions. His cover of David Bowie's Space Oddity was viewed 23 million times in its first year on YouTube. Hadfield's enthusiastic, engaging style has shown millions around the world how fun, amazing, and awe-inspiring space travel really is. Colonel Hadfield's many special honors include appointment to the Order of Canada, the NASA Exceptional Service Medal, and having 2 schools at an airport named after him. His new book, An Astronaut's Guide to Life on Earth, harnesses the wonder and wisdom of his far-out experiences to change the way we see life on this small little planet of ours. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Chris Hadfield to the Free Library of Philadelphia.
Good afternoon. Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. I think we have a little while together, which is a real treat. It was my first day ever in Philadelphia, so I just got in early this morning and went for a run around and looked at the age, and I saw the city. I have this weird perspective that I've seen the whole world over and over and over again, and it's strange now to try and fill in like doing a mental zoom in on Google Earth, where I take my million-foot view and turn it into something 3-dimensional. And so it's delightful to have a chance to spend a little time with you today. I thought I would talk, because there's not very many of us that have flown in space, I thought I'd talk about some of the what it's like, what it actually feels like to fly in a spaceship. But I also want to talk about why, and about what we do and what it means. And that's very much what the first book is about also. And then we'll open it up for questions, because it would be unfair if I did all the talking in here. So we'll definitely maybe split it half and half with Q&A, if that's okay. That work for everybody? Okay, good. We got a plan. All right. Everything eventually comes to a moment, you know, especially when you're trying to do something complicated. And you know, whether it's graduation day or getting married. You know, getting married is kind of a long process, but it comes to that one day where the event is going on. And for an astronaut, it's a lifelong process. Nobody is a 9-to-5 astronaut. It's not your job, it's who you are. It's 7 days a week, and it consumes your life and redefines your life. But it all comes to a point on the day that you leave Earth. That's the crucible of fire that actually defines you as an astronaut. It's the biggest risk you're going to take in your entire life. And it is the dreamed of moment when you're leaving Earth. So it's a very weird existence. Picture how it was for me. I was sort of like the nice young man that introduced me here. I was a real fan of space travel as a kid. I read science fiction initially. I was reading Arthur C. Clarke and comic books, and Star Trek came on TV. I couldn't believe it. There was James T. Kirk right there in my. I grew up on a farm. There in my farm living room, there was a spaceman and Spock, an alien, and it was just fascinating to me. And 2001: A Space Odyssey, the movie came out, and that just stretched my mind beyond anything I'd ever. I didn't even understand it. How did it go from those apes to then the moon to then the baby? It made me think. I'm still thinking about that movie, but But it wasn't all fantasy, because at the same time, people were actually leaving Earth for the very first time. And the Gemini program was going great guns, working towards Apollo, the gauntlet thrown down by Kennedy, and then when he was shot, it became a national imperative that we had to put a man on the moon by the end of the decade. And the huge focus of effort, and it all came to fruition and came to that point in time for those guys on July 20th, 1969, when just amazing to think about. The audaciousness of it, that they were flying down, and they'd only been to the moon a couple times. Apollo 8, Apollo 10, here we are, Apollo 11. Now we're going to land. And they come down, and Neil and Buzz are in that thing. It's got paper-thin walls, and they're floating there in their spacesuits, and they bring it down close. And the place they're supposed to land is all covered in boulders, and it's unlandable. And Neil basically he's 38 years old. He's got his 38 years worth of judgment, goes, nope, can't land there, takes over manual control, picks up his little Eagle lander and starts hunting around for a place to land, finds a smooth spot, takes it over there, touches down with 16 seconds of fuel left. It took me longer to say it, 16 seconds of fuel left. And crammed into living rooms all around the world on their little black and white TVs were people mesmerized by that tremendous combination of human drama and newness in the human experience. And I was one of them. My brother and I were jammed. There was like 50 people, it seemed like, in that living room. And we were sitting, because we were junior, we were way in the back. And we were sitting on the back of a sofa with our backs against the wall, watching, seeing, and the images were really slow, fuzzy, but watching it. And then, for me, the most significant moment was going outside afterwards and looking up at the moon and looking at the moon differently for the first time. This wasn't some random, unknown other world. This was a place where people go. And what was most significant to me, and at the time I just kind of absorbed it, I didn't really think about it, but something that had been impossible just became possible. It was a tremendous gift to give a 9-year-old kid, to show them irrefutably that impossible things happen. And they don't happen because they have to. They happen sometimes because they just barely can. And because a whole bunch of people work really, really hard. And so for a little kid like me, what a door opening that was. It was like, hey, this type of thing happens. And it's really just sort of up to you, whether you want to go through doors like this or not. So I'd resolved that night, walked out of this. We didn't even have a TV. We were at a neighbor's place. Walked out and looked up through it was big old oak trees at the moon, and decided in my little 9-year-old brain, I was about this tall, bad haircut, and my dad cut our hair back then, and decided that's what I want to do when I grow up. I want to walk on the moon. And then I thought, wonder when. I'm going to walk on the moon by the time I'm 45. I chose 45. It seemed like indescribably old at the time, so I chose 45. And yeah, come on in, folks. There's seats up the side here if you like, or whatever. Anyway, and so I decided, late at night, July 20th, 1969, this is what I want to do. This is my goal in life. If everything goes perfectly in my life, I'm going to walk. There's 3 over there. Or you got some here? You good? Okay. I'm going to walk on the moon. And 26 years later, I was laying on my back in the Space Shuttle Atlantis at the Johnson Space Center in Florida, 26 years later. And that's the day when everything comes to a point. That's the wedding day for an astronaut, or the the moment where all of those years of preparation and training, today is the day you're actually leaving Earth. And it's sort of an interesting day, because you wake up that morning And you've been in quarantine for a week because you don't want to catch a cold or something and have to delay the launch. So you've been in quarantine. Nobody can see you unless they've had a physical. You can't see anybody under 18 because kids are always getting colds. And plus, you need a little bit of mental centering time. Everybody wants a piece of you. Every single person who has ever trained you in the last week wants to tell you one more thing. Oh, just remember this one more thing. And so you have this week of quarantine at the Kennedy Space Center. It's nice and kind of monastic and isolated. And you wake up that morning, and NASA has laid your clothes out for you. And I wouldn't really recommend that NASA dress you every morning. You know, NASA is not known for their sartorial innovation or splendor. So I'm looking at the clothing that they laid out for me, and I'm in the same quarantine facility that Neil and Buzz were in, you know? It's just surreal for me. I'm a Canadian. When Neil and Buzz walked on the moon, we didn't even have an astronaut program. The thing I decided to do when I was 9 wasn't hard. It was impossible. There was no route from A to Z. And so it was even more surreal for me to have managed to get to that day and be a part of the crew of Atlantis and wake up and start putting my astronaut clothes on. And they put out black socks, because nothing says spaceflight like black socks, so on go my black socks. Next item was a diaper. And great, so put on my diaper. But back then, they were the big boy pull-up diapers, which is nice. So you put your diaper on, but at Johnson & Johnson at the time, if you can believe it, they put little pink and blue astronauts on our diapers for us. So if it doesn't upset your digestive system, picture me standing there in my black socks and my pink and blue astronaut diaper. Thinking, boy, I look like an astronaut, don't I? And then put on a long set of overalls and walk down the hall, pad down the hall into the suit-up room. And the suit-up room, it's the same room that Neil and Mike Collins, who was with a third part of that crew, the same room that those guys got dressed in. And it's really hard to rationalize the day because you have been dreaming about this your whole life. You've been learning about other people doing it and sort of they don't really seem like real people to you. You've been training for it, so you understand every little detail of it, and your training's been so realistic that it's hard to separate the fantasy of it from the reality that today is the actual day that you're leaving Earth. It's just surreal. I mean, what do you have for breakfast on a day like that? If you were leaving Earth, what would you want for breakfast? And when they go down to the kitchen, it's funny, the cooks say to you, "We'll make you any meal that you want." I remember thinking at the time, wait a minute, I know who else they tell that to. It doesn't sound good. Your last meal. But actually, if you do get a chance to fly a spaceship, I would recommend you eat something creamy, because you're going to see it again later. So just nothing too chunky is probably a good idea. Anyway, so you're in the suit-up room, and you plunk down into these chairs. And it's the big same cracked leather chairs that Neil and Buzz and Mike were in. And there's technicians, and they build the pressure suit around your body, and you run through all the checks. You understand the technical side of this all intimately. But it's still, there's a little secondary self who's standing on your shoulder, just amazed that this is happening. And you go downstairs, all the flash bulbs, get in the vehicle, start driving out towards the launch pad. And you come by the huge vehicle assembly building, and then it's quite a ways out. We launch right on the coast of Florida there, of course, to get the spin of the Earth, as far south as we can here in the States to get, because if you're on the equator, you get a lot of spin. If you're up in the North Pole, you get no spin. So you want to be as close to the equator as you can on the East Coast. So we're down in Florida, and you're riding out towards, right on the edge of the Atlantic, and you catch sight of your spaceship. You're in the vehicle wearing this suit, and your spaceship starts getting bigger and bigger. And it's pre-dawn, so we've got huge lights on it. We keep the lights on it to keep the woodpeckers from punching holes in the space shuttle. and it's getting bigger and bigger. And you notice as you're driving out towards it that everybody else is driving away from it, because it's a 4.5 million pound bomb sitting on the launch pad. And you're about to go sit on it, and then someone's going to light it at the bottom. You hope all the hot stuff comes out one direction. And you get to the base of it, you get in the elevator, it's about 20th floor, you go up 20 stories, and then all of you are kicking around up there. There's the Atlantic right there. You can look across at the vehicle assembly building, and the vehicle is next to you, just hissing, because we're pumping liquid oxygen and liquid nitrogen, or liquid oxygen, liquid hydrogen into it. And the tubes that pump the liquid oxygen and hydrogen are about this big around. And because it's Florida, it's humid. And so they're ice cold. And so it's like the frost that builds up in your freezer, that thick hoarfrost is building on these things. So we scrape it and have a snowball fight up there while we're waiting to get inside. But one by one, you go down the little, it's like walking out a gangplank, actually, out to your spaceship. And there's a white room at the end. And I'm a little bit afraid of heights. So I was like thinking, man, and trying to look brave. And they saved money or weight or something. It's an open grid, So I'm like, oh, really? I don't want to look like a coward walking out to my spaceship here, kind of, like this. And into the vestigial safety of the white room, and then they put the harness on your body. Then you get in your hands and knees, and you crawl into your spaceship. And the shuttle, everybody knows, it's designed to land on a runway with wheels, but for launch, you want the pointy end up, so it's sitting like that on the launch pad. So when you crawl inside, everything's all screwed up. Imagine when you went out to your car, if you walked out to the parking lot and your car was sitting like that, you'd open the back door and you'd crawl in, and you'd stand on the back window and then have to sort of climb your way up, and it's just like that, getting into the shuttle, up and crawl into spot. And slowly, one by one, you get up, you crawl in. And the shuttle was a really primitive vehicle. It was designed in the 60s and 70s and built in the 70s. And so computer technology was, that was Commodore 64 time, so really primitive computers. The shuttle, all of the memory to fly the entire space shuttle had to fit into 128K. Fly the whole vehicle, flight controls, dynamic vehicle design, display generation, everything, 128K of code. So what that meant was there's a lot of mechanical switches because you couldn't automate everything. So in the cockpit, there are about 500 mechanical switches. And you're wearing your big pressure suit, and you're crawling in your hands and knees, and the vehicle's all like this, and you're trying not to bump a switch. Because if you bump a switch, you die, So you don't want to bump a switch, and you're worming your way up. You get yourself on your back. And there's one astronaut in there who is not going to space with you, because you want someone you really trust to make sure it's a 5-point harness, crotch, belly, shoulders, pull you in tight, get all your checklists just right. We carry about 100 pounds of checklists because the vehicle's so complicated to fly. Most complicated flying machine ever built. Most capable flying machine ever built, but really primitive. So huge human interactivity. So we're in there. That person straps you in tight. And then he gave me a note from my wife, which was nice. It said, it was like a little, one of those 3x5 cards that my wife had written me. And he'd gone around and got each of the spouses to write something for their husband. So, because my first crew was all guys. And my card said, I love you. My wife's nice handwriting. And then, please don't die. Which I knew she wanted me to laugh. And then in brackets, it said, I have insurance. The little smiley face. So I'm reading this note, and my family was 3 miles away on the launch control roof, or the roof of the launch control building. And then this guy says to me, and she gave me a kiss for you. So I'm like, laying there like this, thinking, And he leans over and kisses me on the forehead. And I remember thinking at the time, if I do die today, did that have to be my last memory of all the things that were going to happen today? Anyway, eventually, that astronaut had never flown in space. He was just learning, and he was wearing a Velcro name tag. So we ripped his Velcro name tag off, and the inside of the space shuttle was completely wallpapered with Velcro. So we just took his name tag and stuck it to the wall so we could fly it with us and bring it back and give it to him as a souvenir. And then he gathered all his stuff and went down and closed up the hatch. It makes this big sort of rubbery, mechanical, thunking, chunking noise. And then you're alone in the ship. And there's a bunch of pressure checks and communication checks, and everyone else has to get far away from your vehicle. NASA determined if it blows up, it's going to be like a 3-mile crater, so they want everybody outside 3 miles. And what would you think about? You're sitting there laying on your back. The first thing you think about is the complexity of what's about to happen. The vehicle does not fly itself, and there are a million things that can go wrong. It's such a complicated ship. 5 engines and different power generation systems, and the computer integration is so complicated. And we have trained for years and years and years to understand that vehicle to a level like I've never understood a vehicle before in my life. And so what you're thinking about to a large degree is what I'm going to do when things go wrong, because that's what astronauts really do. We visualize failure. That's what we do in life. We don't really visualize success. We visualize failure. What is going to go wrong, and how are we going to stop it from going wrong, or as it's going wrong, react the right way to minimize the impact of it. And so that's going through your mind, and you're visualizing all the things. And there's so much stuff going on that it's kind of overwhelming. And so often someone in a spaceship cockpit will say out loud, okay, what's the next thing that's going to kill us? Because it's a really good way to focus. Because there's always an enormous number of distractions. But something that's going to happen an hour from now, it doesn't matter. What's happening right now, and the very next threshold that is the highest threat, that's the only thing that really matters. Anything that happened in the past, it's just something to talk about. So we say that out loud because it allows you to then realize what you can afford to ignore and what you can really need to pay attention to. And so you're constantly focused on the next thing that's going to kill you. What's the next thing that's going to kill us? And then make sure you're ready for that. And if you manage to go through that little wicket and it doesn't happen, then you focus on the next thing and the next thing. And the corollary to what's the next thing that's going to kill me is with 500 switches and wearing your big pressure suit, one of the other things we say out loud is there is no problem so bad that you can't make it worse. And so you want to be careful with what you do in there, because you throw the wrong switch and you turn bad into dead, just like that. So you're really careful and deliberate laying there, and the clock is ticking down. And the preparation, nobody really understands or understood the huge amount of preparation to a shuttle launch. We have to clear a section of the Atlantic for the solid rockets to fall into. We have to clear a section of the Indian or the Pacific for the external tank to fall into. We have astronauts at airports in France and Spain and Northern Africa in an airplane flying approaches to airports there to make sure that if the shuttle during its launch lost an engine and couldn't turn around and land back in Florida but couldn't make it to orbit, could abort and land in Zaragoza or Africa or Spain or France. And so there's astronauts over there flying approaches, and everyone's talking to each other, and it's just this enormous interconnected house of cards that all has to be in place, and the clock's ticking down. And if everything's still green, at 5 minutes, the astronaut in the front right seat throws 3 great big heavy switches, and those generate hydraulic power. And it suddenly gives the vehicle life. It puts hydraulic pressure into the veins of the space shuttle, and it like pulses, and it like young Frankenstein. Life! The thing is, it's alive underneath you. And then 3.5 minutes before launch, now it's got hydraulic pressure from the auxiliary power units, and it uses the hydraulic pressure to move the huge rudder on the back and to cycle our elevons, but to move the huge engine bells on the back, like 3 gigantic church bells. And all of those are moving and swaying, and you're laying on your back up at the tippy pointy end of this thing, and the whole vehicle sways underneath you, like it's a dragon waking up, or if you've ever like got on a camel or an elephant, and you know how when they get up, there's kind of this weird thing underneath you. It's like that as the vehicle's alive. And the clock's ticking. And you're running through all the next thing that's going to kill you, and you're talking to the crew, and you're visualizing, and you get to 30 seconds, and the vehicle is finished all of its checks. Houston is just a help desk. Florida has done all their job. They've delivered you the vehicle. Everything's ready to go, and the clock keeps ticking. At 15 seconds, we fire sparklers out the back, and that's just to burn off any stray hydrogen that might have collected, because you don't want a pulse of pressure with it igniting with the motors and causing an overpress. And then 6 seconds before launch, the engines start to light. And the shuttle had 5 engines. The 2 huge white rockets that are the only part of you touching the ground, with these big bolts, 4-inch bolts, 8 of them that hold you to the ground. But the 3 liquid engines on the back of the shuttle, so you're standing on these 2 white rockets, but over here are your 3 liquid engines, and we light them 6 seconds before launch, because we need them, but they don't have enough thrust to lift us off the ground, so we can test them. So we run them 6 seconds early, and they're off center. So they apply this huge force to the side of the shuttle. So it's like some giant with a crowbar is bending your vehicle, and the whole thing bends forward. You're up here at the top, so you sway forward with the bend of the vehicle like a gigantic slow tuning fork. And it bends all the way until it kind of creaks to the structural limit of the metal. And then it starts coming back, it twangs back, so NASA calls it the twang. And then as soon as it twangs back to vertical, takes 6 seconds, the engines are up 100%, they've checked in good, and suddenly the 8 explosive nuts fire, release you from the bolts, the huge solid rockets ignite, suddenly you have 7 million pounds of thrust, 80 million horsepower, and you leave Earth. And it's wild. By the time we clear the tower, you're going 100 miles an hour straight up. You watch the shuttle go and clear the tower. By the time you clear the tower, you're going 100 miles an hour. And the power is enormous. And it is violent like you wouldn't believe. It's just shaking you. You're like, you are in the center of an enormous paroxysm of forces like you've never felt. Like maybe if you were standing under Niagara Falls and all the water is pouring on your head, just this huge external force of a place where you are, and it's just roaring, and you're focused as you can be. What's going to kill me next? What's the next thing that's going to kill us? Nope, we got through staging. Okay, here comes roll program. All right, it's moving on the HSI. We're good. Roll program, Houston. We're doing good. Okay, it's stopped. We're on next. Watch throttle down. Watch throttle up. In 45 seconds, you go through the speed of sound, straight up, accelerating. Faster than Chuck Yeager. In 45 seconds, accelerating, straight up. It's burning fuel at 12 tons a second. It's just stupid. It's just this ridiculous brute force. We're going to look back 100 years from now at that and go, what were we thinking? What a terrible design, It's like looking at the Wright brothers airplane now. You go, the tail's on the wrong side. What were they thinking? They had no idea. At the time, it was the best airplane ever, just like the shuttle was the best vehicle at the time ever. And you're riding this thing. And it's vibrating you so hard you can't even focus on the instruments in front of you. You have to grab onto structure and pull your head up off the pad just to let your neck soak up all the vibrations so you can see the instruments in front of your eyes. And after 2 minutes, those huge white solid rockets have done their job. They were just a tube of explosive. That's all they were. It's about 180 feet long, about 13 feet across. They're made out in Utah. They're put on. Actually, the reason they're the size they are is it's the limit of the height of the railway overpasses in between Utah and Florida. That's what limited the diameter of those pieces of the space shuttle, because they had to be transported there on a train. So those things they've given you the thrust. They're just, that's why it was so rough, because they're a 180-foot long Roman candle, basically. Once you light those things, you can't shut them off. Imagine if you got in your car and at some point you put your foot to the floor of a dragster in a motor that you could not shut off until it used up all the fuel. That's what those things are. When they light, you are going somewhere for sure. And they take 2 minutes to burn out, and their job is to get you above the air. because you can't go fast enough to stay in orbit while you're still in the air. There's too much friction. So those guys haul you like a big marionette. They haul you above the air. After 2 minutes, you're 160,000 feet and 6.5 times the speed of sound. And those rockets explode off and fall down into the ocean. But now, since you're above the air, you can go fast. And you've got just your big orange tank and the engines in the back and about 1.5 million pounds of thrust. And as your fuel's burning off, you just accelerate harder and harder and harder, like you're laying on your back and someone is just pouring cement on you more and more and more. Every breath, you're pushing against a heavier force, wearing all your clothes, and it's not comfortable. I mean, you're not like on a Sealy Posturepedic. You're laying on your parachute and your survival gear and all this stuff, squished in, and eventually you're accelerating so hard that it would rip the shuttle apart. And so we take the throttles and bring them back to idle just to keep the vehicle from tearing itself in half. And you're riding this bullet, and the speed is just climbing crazy, and we're targeting 17,500 miles an hour. And finally, as the clock gets there, after 8 minutes and 42 seconds, you are at exactly the right height and going exactly the right direction. Your speed is perfect. You're out of fuel. The engine's shut off. And you're weightless. If you get a chance, I really recommend that you go for a ride like that. It's an amazing experience. And that's just the start. That's just how spaceflight begins. Because everything that's really important happens after that. It's the most interesting part. It's the 4th of July part. It's the fun part to watch. It's the majority of a lot of our training is to be able to do that part right. If you go to space for a year, like Scott Kelly, who's up there right now, you go to space for a year, 50% of your risk in a year in space is in the first 9 minutes. It's the riskiest 9 minutes of your life. And, but it's just the start. And everything that really matters happens after that. It's an amazing, amazing ride. All right. I think maybe what I'll do, rather than keep talking, is I'll just open it up to questions, and I think we'll be able to continue to tell space stories while I answer questions. The way I want to do it is just stick your hand up, say your question loud, I'll repeat it for everybody, and then it just makes it easy. Yes, sir.
I was wondering, you do all the prep work and all the preparation on Earth, but once you hit outer space, is there anything that prepares you for that on Earth, that first moment that you're actually left the Earth and you leave outer space?
So the question is, you spend a huge amount of time preparing for space flight and getting ready for it on Earth, but how and is there anything that prepares you for that first moment when you're in space, when you've left the planet? How do you prepare for that? You can't prepare properly. Simulators are always slightly incorrect. Every simulator is wrong. They do some things close, but it's something I learned a long time ago as I was a test pilot at Patuxent River in Maryland and a fighter pilot before that. And something I learned a long time ago is all simulators are wrong. And the key is to remember that and only try and pick out the stuff that is right. So you can't simulate weightlessness on Earth. There's just no way. Gravity is relentless. So what we do instead is we have an extremely accurate simulator, the best we can build, and it actually shakes during launch. And it makes noises like the real one, and there's flashes in the display, and all of the instruments work, and it's very realistic. And the way that we get over the fact that it's not the same is we make it way harder than the real flight. We get way more failures. When we say the next thing is going to kill you, it kills you all the time. The simulator on Earth, it's just becomes so complicated flying that thing, so that when you do your actual space flight, you go, that was different, but it was way easier, because you've been so used to this huge mental workload. And I would really recommend you do it in your normal life too. If you're setting up to do something that you can't properly simulate for, then try and simulate it the best you can, but make it harder for let's go back to the wedding example. I'm nervous about my wedding. Okay, well, let's simulate it. Let's practice. Let's go to the church and walk through there, or go to the wherever I'm getting married and practice it 5 times. And let's practice that I can't find the ring, or that somebody wrote something on the bottom of my shoes, or I had to go to the bathroom. Or let's practice a bunch of things going wrong, and let's do it again and again. Or the minister, I can't understand it, or I missed my line, or whatever. Let's practice it 30 times, and everything going wrong. Then when you get up there, it'll be different when you get married, but it won't be overwhelming. And it's sort of how we prepare for everything. Yes, sir.
There was a reference to a Swiss Army knife getting to the space station. What's that about?
I flew in space 3 times. My first one was on Atlantis, going to help build the Russian space station Mir. Then my second one was on Endeavour to help build the International Space Station, do a couple spacewalks. My third one, I was the pilot of a Russian Soyuz, and we went up and docked with the space station, stayed there for 6 months, and came back on the Soyuz. So over those 3 space flights, there's a lot of experiences. But on my first one, our job was to go help build Mir, the Russian space station. Mir means peace, and Mir also means the world. It's one of those words with 2 meanings. So they called their first big space station the world, or Earth, or peace. And our job was to make Mir compatible with the space shuttle. And so we were going to bring up this huge docking adapter, about 15 feet long, dozen feet across, maybe 10 feet across. And we launched with it down in the Bay of Atlantis. We got to orbit, opened up the doors. I reached back with the big arm, the Canadarm, and plucked this big docking module out, Stakovich Niatsiek, and stuck it on top. So it was sticking way out the top of the shuttle, like a big periscope or conning tower or something. And then it took a couple days, got up close to Mir, and then drove the whole shuttle up to plug this big piece sticking out the top of us into a similar piece sticking down from Mir. If you look at that sort of silver light above your head, imagine if you had to if you had, I don't know, a little golf cart here with a crane on it, and you were trying to drive your golf cart in your crane to plug your golf cart into that silver light coming down, sort of like that weird balancing thing. And you only get 1 try, and everybody's watching, and anyway. So we docked, but now we've got the shuttle, and we've got this big clown barrel of a docking tunnel in between, and then we've got Mir, this big Russian space station. And you have to equalize pressure between all 3 of them, because you can't open a hatch if one's high pressure and one's low pressure. So we're equalizing pressure. I go racing to the other end of the docking module to open up the hatch, and some overzealous Russian safety engineer has sealed up that hatch in the most unassailable, prophylactic way that you could imagine. There's strapping, and there's gun tape, and there's wires all bound up, and zip ties. And the Russians are on the other side looking through the window at me, and I'm like, "Wah!" And so I'm trying to undo all this. There's all these little tiny knots that some big burly Russian has done up, and I'm like, crap. And then I realize, I got a Swiss Army knife. And so NASA gives us little Swiss Army knives with pictures of shuttles on them. So I get my Swiss Army knife, and I'm like cutting through all this strapping and throwing it back to Jim Halsell, and he's stuffing it in a bag. And my brother, we grew up on a farm, as I mentioned, is a big fan of Army knives, Swiss Army knives. And so partway through, I realized my brother would love to do this. This would be like the crowning moment of his whole life. And so I turn around and look at the camera and float the little Swiss Army knife. And in the Victorinox Museum over in Switzerland, they play that little bit of tape over and over and over again. Eventually, I got all the strapping cut and the wires and everything out of the way and plugged in. And with Sergei Avdeyev on the side, kicking on the hatch, we finally got it open and went into Mir. But don't go anywhere without your Swiss Army knife. Yes, sir, in the far back. What upcoming space mission am I most excited to learn the data from? I don't know if you watched a couple days ago. The hardest nut to crack is launch, still. We have not significantly improved engine technology since Al Shepard launched, or Neil and Buzz, or Yuri Gagarin. But what Elon Musk is trying to do right now, those first 2 huge white rockets that they get you above the air and then they fall into the ocean, he wants, after they spit the satellite off, after they get you above the air, he wants to have just enough fuel left in those rockets that they can fall down close and then have their engines and come back and land on the launch pad again. It's a crazy idea, but a really good one if he can make it happen. And the reason it's a good one is you don't have to throw those things away. If they land safe and sound, you just fill them up with fuel and use them again. Imagine if every time you got on US Air, they had to throw the airplane away. Your ticket price would be way higher. And that's what we do in spaceflight right now. We throw away most of the rocket every time. Elon's trying to figure a way to keep the rocket. If he does it right, it will drop the cost of getting to space by 100-fold. You know, instead of 1,000, it's 10. You know, that type of drop of cost, which will change our access to space in a revolutionary way. It'll be like going from the Wright brothers to jets. You know, it'll be that type of significant technological enabling change. And he's tried it twice so far. And the first one, the little hydraulic thruster at the top ran out of fuel. And well, actually, imagine if you were this range safety officer in Florida and Elon Musk came up to you and said, hey, I want to land a rocket ship back here. You're like, nah, we're not going to do that. So they made Elon build a huge barge, and he takes this barge out 100 or 200 miles offshore, and there's this gigantic flat surface out there. And so he's trying to land his rocket on a barge, which makes it, you know, double hard because the barge isn't anchored. It's just, you know, wiggling around a little bit. Anyway, the first one came down, and it got to the barge, but they didn't have quite enough hydraulic fluid to keep it stable, so it fell over. But this last week, they came so close. It came down, and it came just right above, and they just hit just a little hard. But the trouble is the rocket's going like this, but the barge is going like that. And so, you know, you have to be kind of lucky. And they just touched down, and there was too much relative motion, and it stopped, and then we just leaning, and all the little thrusters were firing, and it went, blew up. But he's tried it twice, and he's almost there. And there's actually, at the Kennedy Space Center right now, there's a landing pad that he's built. And pretty soon he's going to get it right. And to me, that is the most interesting thing. Because what I've been in my whole life, I'm a mechanical engineer. I grew up on a farm with machinery, mechanical engineer. I was a fighter pilot, test pilot, and then an astronaut. My whole life has been in making machinery allow us to do stuff that we could otherwise never do. Allow us to see the world. I've been around the world 2,597 times. Somebody told me that. I didn't count. But I have seen the world in a way that is basically unprecedented in human history, a perspective of our planet. Actually see, you know, when I walk by the big buildings here in town and I think of what Penn and Franklin, you know, they were pretty cosmopolitan people. They were setting up a whole new nation, but even they only knew a tiny little piece of the world. And I have seen a whole world every 92 minutes as it turns underneath me. And that perspective only comes from a relentless drive from a little 9-year-old kid that set his mind to it to try and figure out how to solve all these problems that give us access to a place that maybe we can then understand ourselves in a way we never have in the past. And so for me, the most exciting part is the enabling technology of a step improvement in launch. And I'm pretty excited to see what's going to come as soon as we get there. Yes, ma'am.
My son wanted to know what the buoyancy pool is like, and if you have time, out of those 2,597 trips around, was there a picture that you took or a view of a location that surprised you?
Sure. What's your name? Your son's name?
Danny.
Danny? So there were a couple questions with the family here, and the first question originated from Danny, and that is, what's it like training in the neutral buoyancy pool, which is neutral buoyancy, basically just a big underwater pool. The very first spacewalk was done by a guy named Alexei Leonov, a Russian, 50 years ago, last month. And then the first American spacewalk was a guy named Ed White, not long after that. And they had no idea what they were doing. There was the big space race, and they wanted to be the first, and they were hurrying, and they built these suits, and they hustled outside, and both of them, well, not Ed, but Gene Cernan, just about died during their first spacewalks. They didn't understand what they needed, and they had it all wrong. And Alexei had to actually depressurize his suit down, really risking the bends just to get back inside the ship. And Gene Cernan had the same problem, and his suit completely fogged over. He's outside alone in space with no handholds, with no real idea what's going on, and his visor's completely fogged over and he can't see, and there's no one that can ever help him. And his commander, in fact, Tom Stafford, has instructions that if it doesn't go well, close the hatch. You know, that type of level of understanding. So shortly after that, we realized we're not doing this right. You know, we need to simulate it better. And so the best simulation we could come up with was underwater, because it's not perfect, it's wrong, but it's closer. And so we built a spaceship underwater, or at least a reasonable facsimile of one. And then you get into your spacesuit, and you're lifted by a big crane, because spacesuits are heavy, puts you in the water, and then divers put just enough weight on you so that you don't float and you don't sink. So you're neutrally buoyant, neutral buoyancy lab. And then you get to work. And that's where we invent how to build spaceships. We built the space station with hundreds of spacewalks, and every single one was practiced underwater. I've spent hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours inventing space station construction underwater so that I was ready to do my 2 spacewalks while I was up on board the space station. And it's similar, Danny. It's similar. It's not the same. But the next time you're in a swimming pool, you know, as soon as it gets warm enough, I ran down to the river today. Don't get in the river today. But next time you're in a swimming pool, get a little bit away from the wall and take a great big breath so you're floating, and then gently let out just enough breath that your head just goes under the surface, but you don't plummet to the bottom. You're sort of neutral in the water then. And for a few seconds, you'll have enough air still that you can just feel it. And that's sort of what it's like to do a spacewalk. You can turn and twist in any direction. The trouble with water is it resists your motion, so that makes it unrealistic. But if you have a spaceship underwater and you're wearing a big spacesuit, you could at least get the full 3-dimensional view and the feel of it. You can practice the procedures. You can get stuff wrong. And we discovered something 1 month before launch that we would have completely failed up on orbit if we hadn't discovered it by practicing it in the pool over and over again. So it's really necessary, but it's not perfect. The real spacewalk is so much easier because you don't have the resistance of the water, and it's so much more beautiful because you don't just have a bunch of safety divers in a swimming pool, you have the universe and the world on one side, and you're in the universe with the world. Imagine what that's like. You're holding onto a spaceship with one hand, and if on one side the world is pouring by at 5 miles a second, you go from LA to New York in 9 minutes. You know, you see the whole US in 9 minutes pouring by underneath. And the world's just, and it's nothing like a map or a globe. You know, you go to a globe here in the library and it's shiny and smooth. The world doesn't look, the world is textured and colors. The sun brings, and every time you come around, the weather's different and the seasons change. It's just gorgeous. And that's on one side of you. And if you look under your arm, there's the whole universe. And it's black like if you stuck your hand into it, you'd have the black of the universe on you. It's just so dark and profound. And your one link to 7 billion people is in your hand. And so I was working out there at one point, and this is a long answer. And Houston said, "Hey, Chris, we need to think about something. Just hold on for a couple minutes." I'm like, "Okay, that's maybe the best present anybody ever gave me." And so what would you do if you're holding on to the outside of a spaceship and Houston says to you, "Hey, you got nothing to do for a few minutes"? So I thought, I'm going to just really try and sense where I am and feel how my body feels weightless inside this suit that's weightless, and really look at the world and look at the universe, and then hold on as gently as I can, you know, just floating. Because I was holding on tight, I noticed. But after I realized I don't need to. I'm not fighting any forces. You know, it's the vacuum of space. You're weightless. And I held on really, really tight. And then I got myself perfectly still, and I let go. Just moving through the universe with the spaceship. And then Houston said, "Okay, we need you to get back to work," and grabbed on and got back to work again. But it really felt like me sensing what it's going to be like to leave Earth forever. You're the right age, probably. I think we'll set up bases on the moon over the next 25 or 30 years. I think we'll eventually go to Mars. We're still a long way from Mars. It's harder to get there than everybody thinks. But on the way, I think you're the right age probably to go to the moon and live on the moon. And when we first turn our tails towards Earth and fire the engines long enough to leave, that was sort of the sense of what I had, I think, when I let go of what it's going to be like to be separate from the world and to have the world just a place you used to be. It was a really interesting look. So the underwater training pool is close, but it really just gets you ready. And then your question, ma'am, was?
Is there something that you saw or
Ah.
picture that you looked at?
Part of the world, looking at the world, going around the world 2,600 times, was there anything that surprised me? It is a constant unraveling delight to look at the world. The world is unerringly generous in how incredibly beautiful it is. That's the biggest surprise. It is far more gorgeous than you're led to think. And the first time you come around, it's kind of funny. You look for things that you know, naturally, right? So you look at it and you go, hey, look, there's London, England. Hey, I've been to London, England. And you want to grab another astronaut and say, there's London, and I've been there. Me, I've been to London. London's significant because I've been there. And you do that at first, on your first lap or your second lap. But then after the next time you see London, you go, oh yeah, there's London. Oh, but look, the Isle of Wight. Look, you can see where it's split off the whole English subcontinent there. And then the next time around, you go, wow, there's London, and there's France, and there's Belgium, and there's Amsterdam. And you can see, wow, you can see all the way to Rome. There's Rome right there. And then the 50th time around, it all starts becoming so subtle and nuanced. And the 1,000th time around, it's like you have this intimacy with the whole world where you know where to look. And the angle between the sun and you and the world is constantly changing because of your speed. So it's like this huge searchlight is showing you something different every time. And I was on board the space station to go from one side of the sun to the other. We went halfway around the solar system while I was on board the space station. So summer and winter swapped ends on the world while I was up there. So every time around, the watching the greening and the browning of the world as spring and fall hit. And so it is just fascinatingly gorgeous. And then I asked myself, what do I do with that? I have, you're always taking pictures. I took 45,000 pictures, because you would too. And, but then what do you do with it? So here I am, this little 9-year-old kid. I got to do something I was dreaming about, but now I have been allowed to be witness to something that is right on the verge of miraculous. Now what do? Do I just, go, well, that was cool, and keep it to myself? Or I go home and talk to my wife and say, wow, you would not believe what I saw in space. And to me, it is an absolute imperative as a human being, when you are experiencing something that is really unique, is to try and share it with other people. Don't keep it to yourself. And if you're trusted like we are as astronauts to be kind of the vanguards of so many people, then you not only have like a necessity, but a kind of an obligation to share it with people. And that's the first book that I wrote was my best effort to explain it. And then my second book I went through those 45,000 images, and I just wanted to take people around the world once, as if Danny and I were at the window of the spaceship. If you and I had 92 minutes at the window, and I said, let's look at the world together, what would I show you? What would I want you to see now that I know the world? And that's what the second book was. And I don't want to proselytize and tell people, you need to think this about the world, because that goes away in space. The news is constantly telling us what we ought to be thinking and how we ought to interpret stuff, and it's almost always bad, because if it's bad news, you'll keep on the channel, or you'll come back and watch it the next day. And the world is not like that. The world is enormous and ancient and optimism building and forgiving and self-healing and flat gorgeous. And there's a peace that seeps into you when you see it so many times. And so I wanted just to let people actually see what the world looks like and then draw the conclusions for themselves. So that's why I wrote the second book. How are we doing on time? I think I maybe got time for one more question. Yes?
I was wondering what your thought is on the private companies that are trying to go to space and take people. I mean, what you're doing is wonderful. Do you think that's going to be a bad reflection or cause a...
question is, what do I think about the private companies that are trying to take people to space? And is it different than what traditional astronauts have been doing? I think, number one, commercial companies have always taken us to space. I mean, Grumman built the lunar lander for a profit, and Boeing operates the space station, and Rockwell built the space shuttle. You know, it has always been commercial companies that have taken us to space, always. None of that changed. What people are trying to do now, though, is privatize it so that the customer is someone besides the government. Can you make space accessible enough that a private company or even a private individual can get to space? And it happened in unmanned spaceflight a long time ago. Private companies build a satellite and they hire another company to put it in space with no government intervention at all. But we haven't really done it in human spaceflight yet. The Russians have sort of done it 8 times. An extremely wealthy person could pay to fly with the Russians for a week or 10 days. But the cost, Sarah Brightman, she's a singer with Andrew Lloyd Webber, I think, right? And Phantom of the Opera and such. But I think she's paying about $50 million to go for a 10-day ride. And it's not just a ride. I mean, you know, when you get on American Airlines and you sit down in your seat and they say, okay, and this is the emergency exits, and this is the strip lighting, and these are your oxygen masks, that little 2-minute briefing. That briefing takes about 9 months to ride on a Soyuz. And so Sarah's going through that training right now. She will have no real technical purpose up there. She's a tourist going for a ride with the money that she's made. I mean, nobody gave her any money as a kid. She earned all that money. So it's the early nibbling edges of tourism, but it's so expensive, she's almost as wealthy as some countries, you know. So it's not really privatized yet. But what Richard Branson's trying to do is make it cost about $250,000, which is still a lot of money, but there are wristwatches that cost $250,000, and there are a lot of cars that cost $250,000, and they get bought all the time, you know. Just even a Tesla. You know, there's people that have that amount of money. So that's maybe the start of it. But what Richard Branson's doing, you're not going to orbit the world. It just goes up. You get a few minutes weightlessness and then falls back down and lands again. But it's a first step. And to me, there's nothing wrong with any of that. It's how it's always been. We invent a technology that allows us to do something that we've never done before, but it's not profitable. So then the government comes in and says, okay, this technology is going to be a great enabler for our civilization, so the government's going to invest in it for a while. Like, we're going to build roads across the U.S. That sure didn't turn a profit in the short term, but it made a huge difference for the nation. Or we're going to build airports across the whole country. Or we're going to put up power lines. Someone has to do all that huge initial investment where the shareholders would never pay for the risk of it. And same in aviation. I mean, airplanes crashed all the time in the teens and 20s, and then NACA, which was the predecessor to NASA, built huge wind tunnels, like they're all across the country, and spent huge amount of money making air travel safe, wings and cooling and streamlining and all that stuff, until suddenly air travel became more commonplace. And now, shoot, I mean, it's way within the normal acceptable means of almost everyone to at least get a flight sometimes, at least, you know, on Southwest. We're in that process now with space travel. It started out just 54 years ago as right at the very edge of what we could do, and we're making it more and more commonplace. And right now, with what Elon Musk is trying to do, and what actually Jeff Bezos is trying to do, and what Richard Branson, 3 of the brightest, most successful entrepreneurs on Earth, are all trying to make launch cheaper so that it'll turn space travel into the same sort of thing as air travel. It doesn't mean that the people on board are all going to be astronauts, just like all the people on board Southwest are not airline pilots. But it will still open up the experience to people, and I think it's natural. It's the normal flow of technology versus human experience, and I don't think there's anything wrong with it. And it frees up NASA to do what NASA ought to be doing, which is the stuff that no one else wants to risk. You know, and in December, we launched a vehicle that can take us to the moon, Orion, and it went thousands of miles from the world, and it worked nearly perfectly. It was really a successful test, and that's where NASA needs to be getting the capability to take our young people further and continue to challenge them, so that when there's a 9-year-old here in the States right now who's looking at the space station, that they feel enabled to do things with their life that otherwise they never would have. That they think, you know what? There's opportunity here that I didn't even dream about. And so therefore, I'm going to do different things with my life because I think that's a cool thing to be pursuing. And at the bottom of it all, that's the purpose of it. We need to not only enable, but we need to inspire all of our young people to maximize their individual potential. Every kid that grows up who did not have the opportunity or the drive to maximize their personal potential, to me, is one of the biggest tragedies that we do as a civilization. And so this is not the only thing going on, but it's a pretty cool thing. And I know that it motivates most of the people in this room. Thanks very much.